Hey everybody! As we get into 3D drafting, we need to spend a couple minutes to make sure that all of the stuff that we're looking at looks the same, and then we're going to talk about how to navigate this space and how to make things look the way that you want them to look, sort of. Anyway, the ribbon up here right now is set to 2D drafting, which means that all of the tools available here are 2D tools. So to change that and give ourselves access to those 3D tools, at least through the ribbon, we're going to come down to our status bar at the right-hand corner, click on the wheel, and select 3D modeling. The window is going to change, it's going to reload, and then all of a sudden we have a whole lot more tools available to us. So the first thing you'll notice is that we have a bunch of new tabs available. Nice. But also down here in the main ribbon on the home screen, we have three-dimensional tools as well. Where did the 2D tools go? Well, they're still right here. They're just smaller and with less images or fewer images. Okay, the other thing we're going to change, or one of the other things we're going to change first, is to click on the three lines here that give us more options on our status bar. And we're going to select 3D object snaps, dynamic UCS, and selection filtering. Okay, so what that did was it added a few buttons down here that we can use to change how our system behaves. And we'll talk more about those in a little bit. So the next thing I want to do is to show you what this looks like when we actually start to draw things. So I'm going to use the box command. I could do that either by selecting this up here, or I could easily just type box, hit spacebar to accept, and I'm literally just going to draw a cube. It's going to be like 3 foot by 3 foot by, I don't know, let's make it 6 feet tall just for funsies. Oh, did it take it? Did it take it? Nope. I forgot to hit enter between those two things. Enter, and then I can put in 6 feet. Why aren't you taking it? There it went. Okay, so right now, this looks like a 3 foot by 3 foot square. What gives? Well, what gives is that we're looking at this from the top view. And I can tell that because my ViewCube over here shows me that I'm looking at the top of this drawing. To rotate it around, there's a couple of different ways we can do that. You could absolutely do that from the ViewCube, where I click here and then rotate and do some spinning. Look at that. Nice, lovely, very exciting. Or I could click on it and go to exactly this diagonal view, this I think that's technically the southeast view. Or I could look at it from the right side, so on and so forth. So your ViewCube can be valuable, especially if you want to see exactly an orthometric view, orthographic view. However, most of the time we don't need to see an exact orthographic view. So I want to be able to, scroll around without having to go up here to my ViewCube. The way that I'm going to do that is by clicking Shift and then clicking my scroll wheel, the button function on my scroll wheel, and then dragging it around to move around a pivot point. And this generally will move in a pretty intuitive way. So if I'm over here, it'll still rotate around that object. And that's the way that the vast majority of people, I would say, navigate the three-dimensional space and look at the object that they're drawing from different views. One thing to notice right now is that this is still a 2D wireframe. It is not it doesn't look like a three-dimensional shape. It looks the way that it would if you were to draw a three-dimensional shape on a 2D plane, which is not necessarily super helpful. So we're going to change our view style. The way we do that is either by coming up here and clicking this third thing in brackets and then selecting one of those, or we can simply type VS for VS current, spacebar to accept, and then by selecting whichever visual style we want to use. Or we could also type the letter that is capitalized on each selection. So 2D, well, the 2 is not technically capitalized because you can't really do that, but the 2 would select 2D wireframe, C would select conceptual, E would select shaded with edges. Let's take a look at a couple of those. I'm going to select C, hit space bar, and now I have this shape that's actually represented as a three-dimensional solid. And this is a lot easier to visually understand because it simplifies it by not showing us those lines that would otherwise be hidden. I personally really like I personally like the conceptual visual style because I can see the edges really clearly. The faces are all very different shades, so I can visually understand what that is, and it changes as I'm scrolling around. So I don't know, I like it a lot. This is the one that I typically will draft in. It also stays pretty bright. Some of the other ones, like shaded with edges, will look similar, but all the colors are much dimmer. Let's take a look at that one. VSE space. So this looks gray instead of white, which, totally fine. If that's how you want to roll, that's up to you. I've seen people draft in X-ray, which I personally find confusing because I still have trouble parsing that sometimes. The point is, choose the one that works best for how your brain likes to process it. If you like drafting in X-ray, go for it. If you like drafting in GASP 2D wireframe, good luck, and also go for it. You do you. There isn't a right answer here. It's whatever your brain wants to accept. Actually, no, there is a wrong answer, and that wrong answer is sketchy. Don't do it. It just looks weird. Why would you do that? It looks more weird in 2D. Anyway. Okay, so we've talked about moving around. To pan, still the same way that we did before. It's just panning, as though we're on a page. We've talked about rotating the thing that we're looking at. So let's take a look at this ViewCube again. So the ViewCube shows us something relative to this user coordinate system, this XYZ thing. The UCS and managing the UCS is probably the most difficult thing about three-dimensional drafting because it is always going to mess with us until we learn to master it. So let's talk about what it is and how we can manipulate it in a couple of different ways. So this is basically just the Cartesian plane. Just like in math class, when you draw something, you've got the X, you've got the Y, and that defines a plane. So you can think of that as like the piece of paper that you're drawing on. The Z is the third dimension that gives it depth. That's perfectly fine if I only ever want to work in, from like a paper point of view. But most of the time we're drawing something that actually wants to be in a three-dimensional space from different angles, and we might want to look at it from different angles. You'll notice that when I click on the ViewCube, it doesn't change the UCS. So I might look at this and think that I can edit this as though I'm looking at it as a piece of paper. But I can't because that piece of paper is actually aligned kind of parallel to the top of this object. So it isn't necessarily going to behave correctly. So the ViewCube doesn't change the UCS, but we can change the UCS to various orthographic views, essentially. And we can do that up here in the top corner by changing this. So right now it says that we are in the right view. However, our UCS still is aligned with the top view. If I now click right one more time, it's going to move it around, but more importantly, I now have my UCS aligned with my view. So let's say that I want to draw something from the front. I click up in the view in the top left. I click on front. It rotates it around. It showed me that it did that, and my UCS is now aligned with this front view. I do this so often that I have hotkeys for it because it makes me a lot faster to be able to not have to go all the way up here. I can just click my hotkeys and away I go. This means that some of the tools that tend to behave a little bit funkily can really be controlled because we are using because we're very specific about our UCS. Let's take a look at another function here, another feature here, and that is the dynamic UCS. So let's go ahead and turn this on. You could also turn it on by clicking or typing F6. So let's say that I want to add a cylinder to one of these faces. So right now my UCS is this one. Well, let me show you what it would look like before dynamic UCS. I'm going to type CYL to draw a cylinder. And if I try to put that cylinder here, it's going to define the radius, but it's in the wrong direction. That's not the direction that I want this to go in. So I could totally do that, but I'd have to do some manipulation of this shape. If, however, I turn on my dynamic UCS, I type CYL to start the cylinder command, spacebar. Now, you'll notice that this face is highlighted. That means it has recognized that I probably am trying to add a circle to this face. And now the orientation is correct. And you'll notice that my UCS has not changed. So AutoCAD is trying to intuit what we are trying to do. And it's saying it doesn't make much sense for you to put a cylinder sideways in here. You probably want that cylinder on edge. And we can see that it's kind of intelligently sensing that because of the way that it is highlighting things. So that makes things go a little bit faster, assuming that you're not trying to do something weird. If you're doing things like this, where you're basing something off of another shape that it is that you're working with, this is absolutely a great way to deal with it and to add shapes to things. A lot of times we're doing something that it won't necessarily understand, so it doesn't automatically do this in a way that's really, really useful. So sometimes I have the dynamic UCS on, and a lot of times I have it turned off. And I can do that just by clicking F6. So you can see down here that it's turning off and off, on and off, and that's because I'm typing F6. Okay, so there's my dynamic UCS. That can be super helpful if you're doing something like something that's on a funky angle. Not necessarily as useful if you're drawing something that is not on a funky angle, like aligned with the orthographic views. Okay, the last thing I want to show you with the UCS is that you can change the UCS manually. So let's say that I do in fact want to see this thing at a funky angle. So I went to the top, and I'm just going to use rotate. By the way, rotate, despite being a two-dimensional command, will absolutely work on a three-dimensional object. And I'm just going to rotate it 30 degrees, just so that I'm not snapping into anything useful. So let's say that I want to have a view or a UCS where I am aligned to this face. So this face is acting like my piece of paper. I can do that by typing UCS spacebar, and then you'll notice that my little crosshair thing is now under my cursor, and it's asking me for information. One of the greatest things about AutoCAD is that it's going to walk you through what it wants from you next. So let's pay attention to the commands that it gives us by our cursor. So I have just placed the UCS, and now it's saying to specify a point on the x-axis. So it's asking me to tell it what horizontal is on my page. So there it is. I'm going to click yes. And now you can see that when I move around, I'm basically just flipping the axis that the Y is living in. And if I follow my instructions, it says specify a point on the XY plane. So that's saying if we are on a piece of paper, you're clicking on another point on that piece of paper. So in that case, I can do that. I can also do that. And that's going to establish a plane in the 3 dimensions. So I will click. And by doing that, I have also established my z-axis. So if I want to align to that, or if I'm working with that, now that cylinder will align to that face. So if you have to force it to do something that it won't do with the dynamic UCS, that's the way that you can do that. Something else that's really valuable about this is that I can set this to be a named coordinate. So if I right click and I go to Named UCS and I hit save, I can now give this a name. So that's the face of my cube. This can be really powerful, especially if you're drafting something like flats that are on an angle. You can just set your UCS to be aligned with the front edge of that flat, and now you can manipulate things relative to that rather than relative to the global UCS. There are some limitations. There's issues that you run into with plating if you're plating off of something that is at an angle, but that's a much different topic, and we will come back to that at some other time. Okay. Enough of talking about that. That was our intro to this whole 3D thing. Let me know if you have questions, and see you in the next video.